We've been studying the gospel narratives of the fate of Jesus of Nazareth following his crucifixion. Last time we reviewed the burial account of Jesus, and we saw that one of the principal features of this account is the interment of Jesus in the tomb by this enigmatic figure, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a Sanhedrist, a member of the council, all of whom, Mark says, condemned Jesus to death. Now, before we move on to look at Mark's empty tomb account, let me ask if there are any questions or discussion of the burial account remaining from last week that you would like to talk about first.
Bill, Joseph of Arimathea, according to, I think, some of the accounts, he was a secret disciple of Jesus, and he dissented from the decision to, deliver Jesus to be executed. And was Nicodemus also a member of the Sanhedrin? I think he was. So there must have been some dissent.
I don't think it says that Nicodemus was a Sanhedrist. He was a Pharisee. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was a Sanhedrist as Joseph was. And you're right, George. The later Gospels, as I mentioned, make Joseph's discipleship explicit. They say he was a secret disciple. I think it's Luke who says that he did not participate in the condemnation of Jesus. And many scholars would see these as later Christian attempts to whitewash Joseph of Arimathea, to Christianize him, so to speak, to baptize him and make him a secret Christian, whereas in the earliest narrative in Mark, he appears simply as a delegate of the Sanhedrin assigned to dispose of the corpse. But that was why I argued at some length last week that there are already indications in Mark's gospel that Joseph is not simply an impartial, disinterested delegate of the Sanhedrin assigned to get rid of these corpses in a proper way. He singles out Jesus of Nazareth for special care. He gives him a very proper burial in a tomb. He dares to go to Pilate, even though he had no connection to Jesus on a personal level. And so, and also Mark says he's looking for the kingdom of God, which are the terms in which Mark describes the gospel preached by Jesus in Mark chapter 1. So I think that while these later gospels make explicit Joseph's sympathies with Jesus, that they're already there really in Mark's account, and therefore we can't say that these are just later inventions.
I guess it's John chapter 19, where it says Nicodemus brought the spices to anoint the body, as if he was working with Joseph.
Yes. And Nicodemus is another one of these very peculiar figures who only appears in John 3 when he visits Jesus by night. And you have the famous discussion about spiritual rebirth. And then all of a sudden he pops up here again at the burial to help Joseph of Arimathea and brings this king's ransom in spices to bury Jesus, indicating again this enormous respect and worth that he would see in Jesus, that he would give so extravagant a burial. But this is not mentioned anywhere else in the gospel accounts. This is only in John.
I had a question, though, about the actual burial, though. And I understand the resurrection. I mean, you've got a whole lot of evidence for it. But from a skeptic standpoint, though, I mean, first off, you do have the body being turned over to somewhat of a mystery man, but secondly, they didn't post a guard at the tomb until the following day, Saturday. Yes. So there was no guard that night. And another thing, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but Nicodemus, if he would have been a Pharisee, why would he have been handling a dead body on the Sabbath? I mean, right at sundown on Friday. Can you explain those?
Okay, there's a number of questions there. First, I want to emphasize that in our discussion, we are not attempting to assess the historical credibility of these stories. We'll do that later on. This is just a survey, a review of what does the Bible say about the resurrection of Jesus. So we're simply trying to unfold or exposit, as it were, these narratives about the fate of Jesus of Nazareth without making any assessment as to their historical credibility. But James's point is so interesting. In Matthew, the guard is sort of an afterthought. It isn't there until Saturday morning. It wasn't posted Friday night. So if this were just an apologetic legend that had been invented by Matthew, why does he have the guard posted on Saturday? The body might have already been stolen, the tomb resealed, and it doesn't say they looked inside to see if there was any corpse in it. It could have been empty when the guard was set. By contrast, if you look at the so-called Gospel of Peter, which is an apocryphal gospel from the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, here, the Roman guard, it's explicitly identified as Roman, it is set on Friday. This is a fail-safe apologetic. The guard is already there on Friday, and the tomb is surrounded by not only the guard, but a big crowd of Pharisees and people from the surrounding countryside. That's the way an apologetic legend looks. But the very fact, as you say, that Matthew's guard story isn't airtight, I think lends more credibility to Matthew's account, because that's not the way a later apologetic legend would portray it. Now, as for Nicodemus, we shouldn't, and I'm going to make this comment actually in the lesson today, we shouldn't think that Joseph himself climbed the ladder and pulled the nails out of the hands or wrists of Jesus and took the body down from the cross. A rich man like Joseph or Nicodemus would doubtless have servants to assist them in the process. And so it may be that Nicodemus and Joseph didn't actually handle the corpse themselves so that they could be clean and eat the Passover. They may have had servants do this. We just don't know. Or it could have been that their overwhelming respect and admiration for Jesus simply overwhelmed their scruples about cleanliness. We don't know. Yes, Dr. Bob?
Matthew 27:60 says that this was Joseph of Arimathea's own tomb.
Yes.
So that argues that maybe this was a little more than just a duty that he was fulfilling.
More than what?
More than just a duty that he was fulfilling.
Yes, and everybody admits that in the later Gospels, Bob, like Matthew and Luke, there Joseph is portrayed as a secret Christian. He lays the body in his own tomb, which is new and unused. And as I say, many critical scholars will say these are later legendary attempts to whitewash Joseph of Arimathea, make him look like a Christian. He gives his own personal tomb and so forth. So that would fit in with what they're saying. What you would need to do if you're defending the historicity of these narratives is to show that already in the earliest account, there would be reason to think that these details are accurate and not later inventions. So, for example, Joseph couldn't just lay this condemned criminal's body in any tomb that he happened to find in the area, because it would defile anybody else that was in the tomb. So it's highly likely that it was his own personal tomb, because it would only be if it was his personal tomb that he would have the ability to lay the corpse of this condemned criminal in the tomb. And for the same reason, it also makes the detail very likely that it was a new tomb that had never been used, because then none of Joseph's other family members would be defiled by laying the body of this condemned criminal. So I think you can see in the approach that I'm taking that already in Mark, we have the clues that the later gospel writers make explicit, and would suggest that they're reliable in doing so and not creating legends.
There are no manuscripts of Matthew that exclude that, and later manuscripts include it, indicating that a definite deception had been attempted, so there's no
No, this would
ironclad
have
evidence.
to be, according to these critics, would have to be something that took place in the evolution of the tradition between Mark and Matthew. Now, that raises the question, doesn't it, of the date of Matthew. If Luke, as I'm persuaded, was written prior to the AD 60s, prior to the death of Paul, because Paul is still alive at the end of the book of Acts, right? He's under house arrest in Rome. So it's, I think, very probable Acts was written prior to the AD 60s, in which case Luke, being the first half of the book of Acts, it's a double work, Luke would have been written then sometime in the late or mid AD 50s. And if Luke used Matthew, as some scholars think, that would make Matthew then even earlier, and you're pushing right back very close to the date of the Gospel of Mark, which could be around the AD 40s, something like that. And that closes that window during which these legendary influences are supposed to have evolved these details. It makes it more credible, as I say, to think that they're simply making explicit what they knew to be the case, namely that this was Joseph's own personal tomb and that it was new and unused. But again, we're getting into historicity questions there, which are important, but right now we're simply reviewing what do the stories say. Bobby?
So a question on the language or the writing that mentions Joseph of Arimathea asking Pilate for the body.
Yes.
So historically, is that proper for Pilate to have ownership of the body and for Joseph he would have.
Yes,
he granted
as
the
a
body?
Roman
Is that-
crucifixion, this is under Pilate's
Right.
authority. You see, the Sanhedrin at that time lacked the authority to carry out capital punishment. If there was a crime deserving of death, the Sanhedrin could condemn the man, but they couldn't carry out capital punishment. They needed the Romans, the secular government, to do that. Well, the Romans would never execute Jesus for blasphemy of Yahweh, for the condemnation that he received at the hands of the Sanhedrin. Therefore, his claims had to be represented before Rome as committing a crime that the secular government would recognize, not blasphemy. Rather, his claims to be the king of the Jews, the Messiah, could be represented to Pilate as an offense against Rome. He's claiming to be Caesar. He's claiming to be the king, not Caesar. And in John, you have this explicit where the crowd yells to Pilate, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. And it is that motivation that makes Pilate then condemn Jesus and send him to the cross. So Jesus is condemned on the one hand by a religious court, but then to be actually executed, he has to be condemned by the Roman court, and he's condemned by them for treason against Rome.
I guess my question would be if it wasn't Joseph asking for our permission to receive the body, what would have been, you think, a normal practice at that point? What would have happened?
Well,
if it was
Pilate was generally very accommodating with Jewish sensibilities that time. He had locked horns with the Jewish chief priests before and had nearly caused a riot. This is in Josephus. And so it would keep the peace if Pilate would tend to accede to their demands or requests and do what they want. And so even though Jesus was a Roman criminal and executed under Roman authority, if a member of the Sanhedrin came to Pilate and said, let me dispatch the corpse, I'll take care of its burial, he would be willing to go along with that. And that would be especially, I think, true if he believed that the man was innocent, as the Gospels portray, that he'd been unjustly executed. Yes, Jonathan.
Yep. Do you think Joseph's tomb is the one described in Mishnah Sanhedrin 6, verse 5, of the two burial locations set aside by the Sanhedrin?
As I recall, in the Mishnah, the burial plots for the criminals that are mentioned there are one for criminals who have been beheaded, I think, and then the other one is for those who've been burned, I believe. Yeah. And those would not be what we're talking about here. This would be, if the later gospel writers are correct, this would be a tomb that belonged personally to Joseph of Arimathea and was not an official criminal's tomb. Now, those who think that Joseph was not a Christian disciple, that he was just an impersonal delegate of the Sanhedrin, will say that this may have been a criminal's tomb in which he laid the corpse, and they would deny these other details that we've talked about and claim that this is just a common criminal's tomb that was close enough to the execution site for the burial to take place there within the 3 hours between Jesus' death at 3 in the afternoon and the breaking of the Sabbath at 6 p.m. Terribly interesting, isn't it? These details I find just fascinating. Yes, Steve.
Just following up on I think they took everybody down before the Sabbath, and that was why they were going to break the legs.
Oh,
and
yeah,
so
yeah. They
it had to be
couldn't allow the bodies to remain on the cross overnight or it would defile the land. But it's so interesting that in Mark, Joseph singles out Jesus. He doesn't request, so far as we know, the bodies of the others. He may have been content to say to the Romans, you take care of them, you bury him, but I want Jesus of Nazareth's corpse.
Yeah, I think he was a believer.
All right. What follows next in Mark is the account of the discovery of the empty tomb. Mark 16, verses 1 to 8. Let's read that account together. Mark 16, verses 1 to 8. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the door of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone was rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Notice that the women are said to visit the tomb in order to anoint the body. What is this all about? Some scholars have speculated that Joseph was only able to carry out an incomplete burial of the corpse of Jesus, that during the 3 hours that he had between 3 p.m. when Jesus died and 6 p.m. when Sabbath would be breaking, Joseph could only give him a hurried and rushed burial, and therefore the women were coming on Sunday morning to complete the burial of Jesus. It seems to me, however, that this is an ungrounded speculation. There's nothing in the burial narrative to suggest that this was a hurried burial. It would be a relatively simple burial. Joseph would doubtless have servants to assist him who would have taken the body down from the cross. They could have purchased the linen sheet well in advance since they knew that Jesus was going to die soon. And then the body would probably need to be washed, as was typical. The wrists would be bound, the ankles would be bound, a jaw band placed around the head, and then the whole thing wrapped up in a sheet and packed with dry spices like sandalwood to offset the stench of decay, placed on the shelf in the tomb, and the stone rolled over the tomb. And it's not improbable that such a thing could take place within 3 hours if the tomb, in fact, were close to the spot of the crucifixion. In fact, it's very interesting to compare this time factor to the burial of Ananias in Acts chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. Acts 5, verses 6 and 7. Ananias is struck down. This was not expected. There was no anticipation here. And yet it says in verse 6, the young men rose and wrapped him up and carried him out and buried him. After an interval of about 3 hours, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And poor Sapphira is struck dead as well. Here you have a 3-hour time slot mentioned during which the burial of Ananias is able to be completed and the young men return to the place where the Christians are meeting together. So I think that it's not at all improbable that the body could have been washed, though if you believe the Shroud of Turin is authentic, it appears the body was not washed, but was simply then tied, wrapped up and with the dry spices, and then placed in the tomb, and the tomb shut with a stone. The women are not coming to the tomb to complete an unfinished job. Rather, what they are doing is carrying out the typical ministrations to the corpse that grieving relatives or friends of the deceased would carry out. For 3 days after a person was placed in the tomb, visitors could come and they would bring aromatic oils that could then be poured over the corpse as a sign of their devotion and their grief to the deceased person. And this is evidently what the women are engaged in, these typical Jewish grieving processes. And they come to the tomb wondering, how in the world are we going to get the stone moved? Because it would be far too large and heavy for them to move themselves. But I think their devotion to Jesus, as well as their hope of finding some men who would do this for them, drove them to try to carry out these final devotions to Jesus. Now, when they arrive at the tomb in Mark's gospel, they find what Mark describes as a young man who is sitting in the tomb on the right-hand side of where the corpse would have been laid. Undoubtedly, I think, Mark intends this young man to be an angel. He doesn't call him an angel, he calls him a young man. But the young man is dressed in a white robe, which is typical for angels. The white robe, I think, is a clear tip-off that we're dealing here with an angelic figure. Moreover, you find the proclamation of the resurrection in the mouth of the angel. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. And then he foretells the appearances in Galilee. So I think it's very clear that Mark intends this figure to be an angelic figure, which is sitting in the tomb and proclaims to the women the meaning of the tomb, namely that Jesus is risen from the dead. And it's noteworthy that the very earliest interpreters of Mark's gospel also took this figure to be an angelic figure, namely Matthew and Luke. They understood this to be an angel and call this person an angel. Now, Mark's gospel, as we have it today at least, ends with verse 8, with the women fleeing from the tomb. There may have been a lost ending to Mark. This is highly debated among scholars, whether or not Mark went on to relate a resurrection appearance, such as you have in Matthew's gospel, when they go to Galilee, just as the angel tells them to do, and they see Jesus. But if this is the end of the gospel in verse 8, it's very clear that Mark knows of resurrection appearances in Galilee. even if he doesn't narrate one. Why? Because the angel says to the women, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. So very clearly, Mark knows of resurrection appearances, at least one anyway, of Jesus to the disciples and perhaps a wider group that included the women in Galilee, even if he does not choose to narrate these appearances. Now, verse 8 has caused a great deal of discussion among scholars. The women went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Some scholars have suggested that this meant that the women never told anybody about the empty tomb. They just went home and they never told anybody that they had visited the tomb and found it empty. And that's why the fact of the empty tomb remained unknown for so long, until finally this legend would be mentioned in Mark's gospel. Well, I think you would agree that this is a pretty preposterous suggestion, that the women would never tell anybody ever that they had been to the tomb and found it empty that day, even though that tomb would have still existed and been public knowledge that it was empty. The women never said anything. It seems preposterous. This is just too clever by half. I think it's very clear that what Mark means is that they didn't say anything to anybody as they ran to tell the disciples, in fulfillment of the angel's command to go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before them into Galilee. Trembling and astonishment are very typical Markan reactions to the presence of the divine. And so their silence as they run to tell the disciples would fit right in with Mark's theology of the overwhelming and terrifying prospect of an encounter with a divine person like this angel. It's interesting to compare what the women do with Mark chapter 1, verses 43 and 44, where Jesus gives a command to someone that he has cured of leprosy. Look at Mark chapter 1, verses 43 and 44. Jesus says to the man, he sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to the people." Now here Jesus gives him exactly the same command. Say nothing to anyone. But what he means is on the way to go tell the priest. Say nothing to anyone. But then he tells him, go to the priest and offer the sacrifice that you're supposed to. So it's not meant to be an enduring sort of silence. It's a silence as you go to carry out the mission that you have been given to, in one case, go to the priest, in the other case, to go tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is going before them into Galilee. Finally, another interesting aspect of the empty tomb narrative that does not appear in Mark, but does appear in two of the later Gospels, is the inspection of the empty tomb by some of the disciples after receiving the women's report. This is mentioned in two Gospels, John and Luke. Let's look first at John chapter 20, verses 2 to 10. John chapter 20, verses 2 to 10. And this is about Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb and finding it empty. And then verse 2 says, "So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.' Peter then came out with the other disciple, and they went toward the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. So here Peter and the so-called beloved disciple, who's later identified as the author of the Gospel of John, upon hearing Mary's report, run to the tomb and verify that, in fact, the tomb is empty. Now, intriguingly, this is also mentioned very obliquely in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, in the narrative of the appearance to the disciples on the Emmaus Road. Remember, there are a couple of disciples leaving Jerusalem, going back to their town of Emmaus, and Jesus encounters them on the way. And he asks them what's been going on, and they're amazed that he doesn't know anything about this. And then in Luke 24, verses 22 to 24, these Emmaus disciples say to Jesus, "Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. And they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." So here again you have a reference to a plurality of disciples who, upon hearing the women's report, went to the tomb to inspect it and verify that in fact the body was empty. So we have in John and Luke's gospel this very interesting story of the inspection of the tomb, the verification of the women's report by two disciples at least, and they are identified as Peter and the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. Any discussion or comments about the empty tomb narrative? Bob, and then Ben.
Bill, it's very interesting in the account that you just read, the first few verses of John 20, the
Yes.
three Greek verbs for saw or seeing that are used. John, being the younger man, got there first. So in verse 5, it says he looked in, he observed, and the Greek word is blepo. Excuse my pronunciation, I don't know.
Yes, that's right.
Anyway, it means just simply to have light impinged on your retina and you see, you observe. Okay, understanding is secondary. Verse 6, Peter looks in. Oh, and John incidentally just bent. He just peeked in, didn't go in all the way. Then Peter got there. He looked in verse 6, and the Greek word is theorio, which means to behold and consider, be kind of interesting as to what's going on. Then in verse 8, John gets up enough courage and has thought about it long enough. He goes in and actually goes into the tomb, and the Greek word there is horeo, which means to discern, see clearly, and to understand. So this indicates that the stone was rolled back, not to let Jesus out, we know that, but to let others in so that someone can look in there and have a reasonable assumption that, hey, a miracle, by the disposition of the grave clothes, a miracle has occurred. Now, one way would be if he were wrapped with strips. In John, earlier in the end of 19, it says his account is he was wrapped with strips of linen. The other ones did not use strips. So, and also myrrh can be a shellac-like substance. Some people have said if you wrap strips around a body with myrrh, you're going to have a hardened cocoon. Now, you said last week the argument against that is that actually, even though the Israelites were in Egypt and they learned about embalming, there's no evidence that they did it. And also, if you wrapped with strips like that, without embalming, you'd have gaseous problems, so that's one argument against it. The other argument against that is also the what I believe to be a plausible explanation for the Shroud of Turin is a burst of radiant energy.
Yes.
And that would argue the cocoon thing. That would be we would probably see that on the Shroud of Turin if that were the case. However, something happened. We wouldn't have to have that. We wouldn't have to have a hardened cocoon. It was something about the disposition of those grave clothes that someone said, wow, a miracle has occurred. There's no way that body could have been gotten out of here and those clothes look the way they did. And that can account for perhaps many believers, come in that tomb. People came by and looked in there, and that could account for the number of believers.
Yeah, I do not think that we should think of Jewish burial practices as being these sort of cocoons involving mummies. The plurality of the linen strips that you're referring to are probably the strips that are used to tie the wrists and the ankles, and then the band around the jaw to keep it from falling open. So that we shouldn't think that in John's mind he's imagining a mummy that's being wrapped up. Given that they didn't embalm the bodies, the corpse would explode and be destroyed. So probably what we're thinking of here, it says that he saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin which had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. This was probably a sort of jaw band that went around the head, and it could have been twisted, like you twist a towel and then tie it at the top, and they see this loop lying off by itself next to the shroud. And no grave robber is going to bother to untie the body and carry it off, limbs flopping, and leaving the grave clothes behind in the tomb. So I think that this is what caused John to believe, as you say. They didn't know the scripture, but it was the presence of seeing these grave clothes that made John think, yes, he's arisen from the dead.
I assume the women who went to the tomb didn't know the measures that had been taken so that the body couldn't be stolen. So if the resurrection had not happened, they would have been met with the Roman guard as well as an official Roman seal that could not possibly be broken, right? So there's no way they would have been able to get into the tomb.
I'll let you continue to speak, Ben, but let's remember, as already indicated, if Matthew's guard is historical, it wasn't set Friday evening when the women observed the burial. Mark says they were at the cross, they were at the burial, they saw how the body was laid, and then they came the next morning early.
Saturday morning?
Not Saturday, I'm sorry, then they came on Sunday morning. When the Sabbath was passed, then they came on early Sunday morning. And if there was a Roman guard there, as Matthew says, they wouldn't have been aware of it. I think you're quite right. They would have rested on the Sabbath. They wouldn't have known of the presence of this guard.
Right. So if the resurrection had not happened, there would have still been a seal over the tomb and a Roman guard there Sunday morning when they showed up.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
and what we have to say, I think, from Mark's empty tomb story is that if the Matthean guard story is historical, that the guard had already fled.
Right.
And gone back to the chief priest by the time the women arrived.
Right.
So that when the women in Mark arrive, they don't see the guard. The guard, rattled and shaken by seeing the angel and the stone rolling back, had already fled. And so in Mark's gospel, you don't have it mentioned. So it's not impossible to harmonize these accounts.
Sure. No, that makes sense. But this would have prevented them from being able to do what would have been normal, like going and putting the Roman guard and the seal over the tomb. That was the Romans and the Jewish people the Sanhedrin who wanted that done, prevented these women from being able to do what would have been normal.
Probably, yes. Okay, Charmaine.
I'm curious about Mark 16, verse 7. But go, tell his disciples and Peter.
Yes.
Is that because he denied Jesus and Mark wanted to be able to confirm the fact that he had been restored, or what is your opinion of that?
There are a number of interpretations of Peter's being singled out there, and I think at the end of the day, we don't know for sure. Some have said, is this indicative of an appearance to Peter? That there was a special appearance of Jesus to Peter in Galilee that he would see. And that's why he says, tell Peter and the disciples, there you will see him. Or, as you say, could this be a reflection of Peter's having betrayed Jesus and denied him? And this is Jesus' reaffirmation of Peter that he will see the risen Lord. Or, and I think this is very plausible, this could just be, frankly, a reflection of Peter's leadership in the New Testament church. By the time this was written, Peter was the chief apostle, a leader in the Jerusalem church, and so he's singled out here for attention as being someone to whom Jesus was promising this resurrection appearance. So any of those, I think, would be plausible, and we can't be sure of which is correct, I think. Steve. And this will be our last one.
So we think that Mark, a lot of his information came from Peter. Is that right?
Yes, that is the tradition. Papias and other very, very early sub-apostolic fathers, the church fathers that knew the apostles, attribute the Gospel of Mark to Mark, who was a co-traveler with Peter and served as his interpreter.
So that would make it really bizarre that he ended the story with the women and nothing about Peter having come to the tomb, right?
Right. It would seem ridiculous to say that if he's aware of the belief in the resurrection in the early church, that Mark would pretend that this was a permanent silence. I find this just far too clever by half. It's just utterly implausible to think that Mark was intending this to be a permanent silence. All right. Well, let's close with a word of prayer, and next time we'll turn then to a discussion of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus in the gospel traditions. And now may the Lord Jesus, risen from the dead, ascended into heaven, and seated above all authority and power at the right hand of the Father, equip you with everything good to do what is pleasing in his sight and his will until we meet again. Amen.